Hey everybody, so this week we're going to take a deeper dive into Ardour, and you're going to need a few things to do this tutorial. You're going to need to go to tal-software.com and download from the plugins page, download the free TAL Noisemaker VA synthesizer, virtual analog synthesizer. We're going to be using that, download it for your platform. And also from the Blackboard, I've compiled a folder full of sound fonts for you. So you're going to want to download the sound fonts from Blackboard. And actually, if you want more sound fonts that are in there, it's very easy to just Google sound fonts and download a wide range of sound fonts that are available for free on the internet. So I've developed my sound environment here a little bit. So I've got 4 layered tracks here to create a denser sound environment. So I've got the first 2 sounds that we worked with last time, then I've added this subtle wind in trees and distant washy noise, and then I've got this walking through leaves with some added sounds. But once you start working with a group of tracks like this, there's some additional considerations, because as you start to develop rich, textured sound environments for a story to live on, they're going to be competing with the story. And of course, turning down the volume is one obvious solution, but often in order to preserve the intelligibility of the audio, you have to turn the volume of your backgrounds down so much that you really lose their texture. And there's a way to solve that problem, and it's one of the keys to sound design. So let's listen to this with all the volumes still up. And I've removed all our volume automation from the last tutorial, so that's not in play right now. The humans use the Arecibo Observatory to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. So you can hear the voice is pretty buried in there. So there's one very common effect that is used on voices all the time in radio, in podcasting, called compression, that helps bring the voice out of any environment that it might be trapped in. And it's the reason why commercials sound loud, even though they're just as loud as everything else. They're consistently more loud, and that's because they're highly compressed. And you don't necessarily want a highly compressed sound on all your voices, but you will rarely find a vocal track that doesn't have some compression on it. So let's take a look at what compression is. We're going to go to our audio track, and we're going to add a new plugin by creator, Ardour Team Compressor, a compressor LV2. I'm going to double click that and it gives me this control panel. So the idea of compression is a little bit difficult to wrap your head around at first. What compression does is when there's a peak in the volume of the audio, when the volume of the audio increases suddenly, the compressor turns the volume down. And the more strongly the sound peaks, the more forcefully the compressor forces the volume back down. So basically, it's a way of removing volume peaks from a sound. So it's kind of the opposite of normalization, if you think about it. Normalization looks for peaks and then scales everything up so the peaks fill the entire range of amplitude for the digital audio signal. However, compression looks for the peaks and turns them down so the peaks are closer in volume to the quieter sounds. And there's a number of controls that help us fine-tune that. Let's just see some compression, and that will help us potentially understand what's happening. I'm going to solo my vocal track and play it with this compressor in line. The humans use the Arecibo Observatory to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. Okay, so that green line that's running up and down this diagonal, that's the volume of the sound at any given moment. And this bar here is the threshold. You see, as I drag this threshold bar, it also moves this dial. So compression doesn't start until the peak level of the sound passes the threshold. So if I have a threshold that's way up here, real intelligence, their desire to make a connection, there's no compression happening because the level of the sound, the volume of the sound has not passed the threshold. But if I drag my threshold down here, we're going to start to get some compression. And what compression is this reduction of volume of the sound. The further it is past the threshold, the more its volume is reduced. So we can see by the shape of this, ordinarily my sound would keep going up in a straight line. The compressor causes my volume to go up at a more shallow curve past the threshold. So when my input volume is reaching -10, my output volume is only reaching -20. Let's take a look at what this does to the sound. The humans use the Arecibo Observatory to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. Their desire... And you say, well, wait a second. That's making the whole sound quieter. Yes, it is. And that's one of the things that's a little confusing when you're trying to wrap your head around compression, is the act of compression turns down the peaks and doesn't do anything with the quiet sound. So the overall effect is a quieter but more uniform volume. So there's always, after the compressor, what's called makeup gain, where you turn up the volume of the whole thing. All right, so you compress it. So now all my sounds are going to be, my quietest sounds are going to be hitting -40. And my loudest possible sounds will still be hitting 0. And there's going to be nothing down here in this quiet range. So now listen to what it is. The humans use the Arecibo Observatory to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. Their desire to make a connection, and that's much clearer, but it brings my noise floor way up. So this is too extreme a compression. We need to do less makeup gain, but we can change the ratio, which is the angle or the rate at which the sound is compressed or the volume is reduced, so that we still have the possibility of hitting 0 dB. Also, the knee is the softness or the curve of this transition. Because sometimes this compression knee can be audible. You can actually hear it kicking in, and it can be a bit disturbing. So by working with these different controls, you can get a compression that doesn't raise the noise floor too much, but still compresses sufficiently that your quietest words and your loudest words aren't as far apart in volume as they used to be. The humans use the Arecibo Observatory to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. Their desire to make a connection. So now let's listen to this compressed audio with our background at full volume. The humans use the Arecibo Observatory to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. Their desire to make a connection is so strong. So already we can hear that by compressing the voice, I've helped it to stay above the background sounds, even without turning down the volume of the background sounds. There's also another thing we can do to the background sounds that will help the intelligibility of the text over them without turning down the volume. But before we do that, we're going to have to learn one additional concept, and that's the concept of buses. So right now we have our background on 4 tracks, and we certainly could and know how to create a volume fader track on each one of these and create, with the pen tool, create a volume curve. So the volume, starts at a certain level, fades out at a certain level, and that's great, but it's just handy to be able to fade them all out at the same time. Similarly, it's handy to be able to apply an effect to all of them at the same time, which we're going to be doing in a moment. So what we do is we combine the 4 tracks into a bus. And the way we do that is it requires a couple of steps. We go over to the mixer, And here we can see our vocal track and our 4 tracks that make up our sound environment. We're going to add a new track. It's going to be a new type. It's going to be an audio bus. And we're going to now add our audio bus in stereo because we may be adding effects to it that will have some panning in the left to right field. We don't want to lock ourselves into a monophonic bus. We add it. So now there's a new track in our mixer. How does this work? Well, if we scroll to the bottom of our mixer, we'll see right now all of our tracks are assigned to master. But if we change our 4 background sound design audio tracks to be assigned to bus 1, I can push this up a little bit so you can see exactly what I'm doing here. I'm choosing bus 1 in. Click on master, choose bus 1 in. I'm creating a routing where these 4 tracks that make up our background audio no longer go directly to the master fader. First, they go to the bus. So any effect I add to the bus and any volume changes I make on the bus will affect the mix of these 4 tracks that are now bussed together. So if we go back to our editor, we see we've added a bus track down here. You've probably noticed this already, but you can take tracks and scrunch them so they don't take up as much space on your screen. And so I'm scrunching the 4 that I'm putting into the bus because I don't really need to see their volume faders anymore, because this acts as a master volume fader for the 4 tracks that are on that bus. It's the Arecibo Observatory to look for extraterrestrial. Take out my entire background, bring my entire background back in, or animate my background sounds by creating a volume transition. The humans use the Arecibo Observatory. But before I turn down the volume on this whole bus, I want to introduce one more concept first, and that's the concept of filtering. And we've actually already done some filtering. We did it when, you remember, we took out all the low frequencies of this voice in Audacity. That's a type of filtering or a type of equalization. We're going to do some more right now. We're going to add a new plugin by creator Ardour team. We're going to add the EQ. And EQ and filter are essentially the same thing. We'll see the difference between them later on. But for now, you can think of EQs and filters as tools that amplify or attenuate sounds based on their frequency spectrum. So you can change the volume of the low parts of the sound, or the mid parts of the sound, or the high parts of the sound. And what we previously did is we took the low frequencies out of our voice recording to get rid of low frequency noise. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go into this EQ, and we're going to take, and since this EQ is on the bus, this is going to affect our entire background. We're going to notch out some mid frequencies to make space for the human voice. We're scooping out the mid-range frequencies of our background because that's where the intelligibility of the human voice is, between like 1,000 and 2,500 hertz. So I'm grabbing this filter number 2 here, and I'm turning its volume down. And this is centered around 847 hertz. I'll make this a little higher. And then the Q is the steepness of this notch I'm creating, the steepness of this notch filter. So you see, as I increase my Q value, it's a gentler curve. So I've scooped out the mid-range frequencies. I'm still going to get the lows, and we know there's no human voice there. I'm still going to get the highs, and there are frequencies of the human voice there, but they are not as tied to intelligibility. This is why telephones work the way they do, and cell phones. They save a lot of data by not sending the high frequencies, because even though the voice doesn't sound as good, we still understand it as long as this mid chunk is present. So let's hear what that does. The humans use the Arecibo Observatory to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. All right, let me play that again, and I'm going to bypass my EQ. The humans use the Arecibo Observatory to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. Can you hear the difference? The background environment competes much more with the voice until I scoop out these mid-range frequencies. And when I do scoop it out, without turning the volume down at all, I'm creating space for the voice to emerge from the background. The humans use the Arecibo Observatory to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. Their desire to make a connection is so strong. And really, this is absolutely one of the most important secrets of effective sound design, is thinking in terms of frequency. What's happening in the high frequencies? What's happening in the mid frequencies? What's happening in the low frequencies? Are they conflicting with one another? Are they supporting one another? And again, this is not something I needed to have told you before, because you can create a whole sound design, and as long as you create a bus in your mixer, you can go back and drop an EQ onto your whole background, and it will affect all the work you've already done. So let's just look at one more feature of the plugin effects in Ardour. I'm going to go to Audio 3 here, which is my rustle, subtle wind in trees, and I'm going to add an EQ plugin to it. And now when I go to the automation track, I can see processor automation, and I can see all the parameters, all of the controls of that EQ, and I can automate those as well. For instance, frequency 1. So now I can draw a graph that will control this frequency 1 position and sweep it through the sound. First, let's just do it by hand and see what effect it's going to produce. I'll solo this track. Right, that gives me a great effective wind sound, and if I shaped it a little bit differently, I could get a nice wave sound out of it. Let's take a look at how to automate that. I simply go to the pen tool and click some automation marks. Go into play mode. I'll open up my EQ so I can watch it move and play it. And those are not entirely realistic wave sounding things, but you can go in there and adjust to taste. And also you might want other controls to interact with it. For instance, you might want to automate the Q as well. So we can go here to automation, processor automation, EQ, and Q is bandwidth, that's the same thing. So 1 bandwidth, and automate that. And we'll see these two automations play back together, as long as they're both in play mode. And there you can automate the parameters of any of your effects in this way. So let's move on to the next thing, which is sound fonts and synthesis. So I'm just going to mute this entire bus for the moment, and by muting the bus, I'm muting all of my background sounds. And I'm going to create a new MIDI track. When I add the MIDI track, it automatically puts in a general MIDI synthesizer. This is not the synthesizer that I want. I want to say new plugin by creator, Ardour team, and I'm going to add the Fluid Synth. And Fluid Synth is a synthesizer that plays back sound fonts. So it says plugin setup, an instrument plugin is already present. What do I want to do with it? I want to replace it. So now I have fluid synth instead of general synth, and it calls up this control panel. And the only thing we're going to interact with on this control panel is this SF2 file. We're going to click here and load one of our sound fonts that you've downloaded. Sound fonts, and I'll pick a string sound, legato strings, open. So now I've got an orchestral string sample that I can add into my sound design. Now, one thing I should point out is using musical sounds in a sound design doesn't necessarily mean you're a musician or a composer or have to have the skills of a musician or a composer. A low string sound underneath a scene is something we all understand the power of, and you can intuit what the right sound is and what the right note is, even if you've never trained on a musical instrument. So I'm not asking you to be musicians here. I'm just asking you to explore the entire palette of sounds that you have available to you. And within those sounds are certainly sampled instrument sounds. So if we widen the MIDI track, we see we get a musical keyboard. And if I hit a key on that keyboard, I'll get the corresponding note. And that's great because that lets us audition the sound. And by dragging this, I can get a larger key range or a smaller key range if I want to focus in on a small group of close-by notes or make large jumps. And to put the notes in, again, I'll be using the pencil tool. So find the range where you want to be working. Work a little lower here. It's a nice dramatic low range. I'll grab the pencil tool and first I'll draw a box over the area where I want to make some notes. I can use the plus tool to zoom in, and once I've created an area, then I can simply drag in notes the length that I want them. To add another note, simply click and drag. And you can hear there's a difference in quality between these two notes. Your sound fonts are not all going to use the same sample across the entire keyboard. They're going to change at certain points. So we can hear that there's a change in quality between these two notes. If we add a third note here and click to shorten this first note, we'll hear these two notes are clearly based on the same sample, and the third and fourth notes are based on a different sample. You can click at the beginning of a note or at the end of a note to change its length. You can click in the middle of a note to change its pitch. And you can certainly stack notes to create chords. And feel free to do this intuitively and playfully. Don't worry about what the notes are if you're not a musician, because you'll find things that are interesting. And if you hit something that doesn't sound good, try something else. And you can, with the move tool, with the hand tool, you can move this entire region around. Once you've created it, go back to the pen tool to edit within it. And you've also got your automation, so you can automate the fader on this to create volume changes. Put this in play. And it's nice to add effects to these as well. So we could, for instance, add a reverb and a delay to this. Start with the delay. And I just updated Ardour, and I have these new control panels that are different from the last time I showed you this. This is a nicer delay control than we had last time, but still the same basic controls. Amount of feedback is here. Delay time is here. So I'll go for quite a short delay here, with very little feedback, just to give a little bit of echo. And I'll add on top of that a reverb. This has the same control panel. And of course, as soon as you unmute, this will mix right in with all the rest of your sound design. The other MIDI instrument I want to introduce is not a sample player like the sound fonts, but is actually a synthesizer where the computer generates the sound. You have to install the synthesizer you downloaded, the TAL noisemaker, follow the installation instructions for your platform, and then under Ardour Preferences, you're going to go to Plugins and say Scan for Plugins. Click the Scan for Plugins, and it will scan your computer for all available plugins. And if you've installed the TAL noisemaker, it will find the TAL noisemaker, and when you create a new MIDI track, I'll mute the previous one, and I go up to say New Plugin by Creator. I can now go to TAL Togu audio line and choose the TAL noisemaker. It doesn't matter whether you choose the VST or the AU. They're just two different versions of the same plugin. And same as before, we want to replace the general MIDI synth, and it will call up the TAL noisemaker interface. And you select the sound that the TAL noisemaker is playing from this menu here. So I'll choose this infected. And like before, if I make the track taller, I get a MIDI keyboard. And I can access this sound at different ranges of the keyboard. And you've got a huge range of sounds here, from bass sounds to chord sounds, effects, keyboards, and you can play around with these. These LD stands for lead. These are synthesizer leads. And so you've got the entire palette of synthesis available to you from this very powerful free synthesizer. And every sound is created through a manipulation of these various controls. And actually, this is the first step into what the whole next section of the class is going to be, which is going to be generating sounds to use in your sound design and in your storytelling.